Hello there, and welcome to another episode of 2CP, where I give my 2 copper pieces on all things D&D. Today is about 5 tips for brand new Dungeon Masters. My first tip is put as much work as you're willing to. Writing a homebrew campaign, especially, can be super overwhelming. It's probably overwhelming where you don't even know where to start. And in order to do that, my biggest suggestion is to start with the aspects that you are most interested in, whether that's a map or an NPC. Maybe there's a villain that you really want to write that seems really cool to you, terrain, maybe even a monster. What I like to think is once you build your foundation blocks, I like to call, you can build outwards. And when you build outwards, that's when you really see the world begin to develop. I think that if you start small start small and then build on over a few months or even a few days, your world would be able to come alive, so to say. And also, don't forget to take breaks. If you feel a little bit burnt out, take a breather, do something else, and then come back. It's always something that you should be aware of. Tip number 2 is don't have any expectations. You don't have to be Matt Mercer or Matt Colville or any of these huge personalities in D&D. I like to think that shows like the Adventure Zone or Critical Role would not be as great if it weren't for the collaboration attempt. And everyone approaches the game differently. Your players are not the same, and you are also not the same. So don't even attempt to be them. In addition to your players, they will have a tendency to make dumb decisions. It's a fact. It's part of D&D and probably one of the most fun aspects of D&D. Everyone here is trying to have fun, and also if that means you're also having fun, that's pretty much the game, and you should facilitate that. Don't expect to be perfect. There's no such thing. You will make mistakes. It comes with learning anything new, from D&D to learning the piano. But, I'm still making mistakes myself. I'm sure Matt Mercer is making mistakes himself, and I'm sure you will too. So one thing that helps me learn more from my mistakes is to have a little notebook on the side, write what's going on, and talk to my players, and kind of in the back of my head come up with some idea of how I would have approached it differently. And possibly when you get back into the game, you will come up with a solution and you will be aware of it this time. You can only learn more about D&D by doing. Third tip is to have a session 0, and that does not just mean having a session 0 where everyone meets up. You could do this over text if you want. You could also do this online or in, a Discord server. At first, I did not do this, at all. And I deeply regretted it in the long run. It was part of the reason why the previous campaign was not as great as I hoped. Some groups, depending on how well you vibe with them, you may be able to get away with not being able to do a session 0, but I've known the current group I'm in for a very long time, and even as much as I know them, they still, there may be some miscommunication or something is not just made clear. You also may or may not know the players that you're running the game for, if you're just trying to DM online for fun. And the way I imagine Session Zeros is Session Zeros should be like trailers for a movie. And I'm not talking about trailers that reveal the end plot or some sort of cameo. I'm talking about those trailers that give you the baseline informations give you a time period, gives you some like core concepts in the world to, you know, recognize. And so then when you go to the movie theater, you actually have an idea of what the movie is about. And the goal of these session zeros is to lay out any campaign expectations, adjust any rules that may or may not be in the player's handbook, maybe for your players, determine a party dynamic. And, you know, otherwise, if you don't do this, you may or may not have a very functioning party. As much as they want to function, they will not function. Tip number 4 is to over-explain than to leave things vague. And this kind of follows the previous point that I made, because it is something I struggled with when I first started. Communication is super key in D&D, and in an ideal world, the players would ask questions, become engaged with the story and what you're putting in front of them, and you and them would have a imaginative link where you're on the same page. But this doesn't always happen. It's like asking 5 different people to draw a house, but when they all finish drawing, they all have different number of windows, a different shape for a roof, maybe a different shaped door, but you will need to figure out how to balance that over explanation for the more general things versus, you know, leaving it in, and you may or may not have different interpretations about how the world works. Tip number 5 is super important, like the rest of these tips, but it's asking your players for feedback. It's very tough at first because you want to, as a DM, I want to tell people more about like what's happening in the world, and especially if they're my players, I want to tell them, this is why this is this, and sometimes I do. But asking them about the game is, I think, one of the most humbling things you can do as a DM. It's part of the reasons why my podcast exists, is because I struggle a lot with understanding my players, and more specifically, understanding their characters take up a lot of time. And, you know, sometimes you'll run a campaign where your character, or the player characters are the actual players themselves, and, you know, that's fine if you're okay with it. Ask them if they had fun. Ask them if the battles and encounters they had were challenging. You'd be surprised about what your friends would say about your campaign. And when people say, oh, it's good, it's okay, instead of, you know, something a little bit more specific, maybe that means you should maybe try for something new. It really depends. And depending on the friend group that you have, I think you will succeed more and grow as a DM. That's it for today's video. 5 tips for brand new DMs. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please leave a like down in the comments section down below. I'm going to make a follow-up video for this in a few days, which is 5 tips for brand new players. So stay tuned for that. My question of the day for you is, what do you struggle with as a dungeon master? I will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.